Here we go. Nice to see so many of you here. Brilliant. Thank you,
Hello.
Darren. Thank you for joining us today.
A pleasure. I now can't see myself, but that doesn't matter. It's probably just as well, or I'll just be constantly distracted by my
Yeah,
own.
and I may switch to speak of you just because of recording for the podcast and stuff. But yeah, thank you to everyone for coming. Just for those who might not, we've got some colleagues here as well who might not be familiar with the modules. So Darren very kindly agreed to come in and speak to us today as part of the storytelling and collective psychology module we've been doing. This is our last class for Christmas, so this is really nice. A lot of this module has been based around the book that I wrote about Darren's work and on collective psychology. What we've been trying to do on the module, Darren, is understand the importance of storytelling in our personal and collective lives, right from mental health and personal well-being and so on, right through to politics and current affairs. And excuse me. We tried to understand, try to be positive as well, and try to understand how we could tell stories for a better future and to improve the state of our collective psychology. So we've kind of gone back to your work on and off throughout the module. We've kind of approached you in a Jungian sense as our kind of magician or wise elder that we can go to on our journey to try and make sense of the world. One thing that we keep coming back to, we've come back to a few times throughout the previous few weeks, is this idea that you talk about the things in life that make us feel most isolated are often the things that we actually have most in common, or things that connect us. That seems really prevalent in your current work and your stage show and latest book. Do you want to just talk about that idea for a minute?
Yeah, it's actually, it's very much at the core of this show I'm doing now, Showman. And actually, that it was weirdly, that show was written to go out the week that the first lockdown hit, and then we had to pull it back, and then the lockdown happens, and it was a very literal play out of exactly that idea, that the things that isolate us or make us isolated feel like are the very things that we all share. And it's sort of I think it's a really core thing, and I sort of get at it in this show by talking about, there's sort of horoscopes that say, they say things that kind of apply to pretty much all of us. There's sort of horoscopes you read in the newspaper, and you can always do that thing where you read someone a horoscope, but that you've read the wrong one, but you don't tell them it's the wrong one. And if they sort of believe in that kind of stuff, they normally go, oh yeah, that's amazing. And then you go, well, actually it was for Aquarius or whatever. But it's easy to then just dismiss them as, oh, it's just silly. They're just stuff that apply to everybody. But then I just thought, well, that is kind of amazing that they apply to everybody. There is something potentially really valuable in that idea that a lot of the time we're all sort of suffering with the same kind of stuff. And when psychics and so on do talk to you and say, oh, you're going through these troubles and these difficulties, and we kind of nod our head and go, yeah, that's really insightful. Actually, what's being highlighted there is how a lot of these difficulties are quite universal. And it also, I think, points at a really vital thing that we've lost a sense of, which is the role of fortune, at least what the ancient Greeks used to call fortune. That you have, it's this, I'm sure a lot of this stuff I'll be saying maybe you've already spoken about, but there's a recurring idea I found through history of the X equals Y diagonal, where you've got one axis is all your aims and your plans for life and what you want to achieve, and that's one axis, and the other axis is just what they used to call fortune, which is just life. It's just what it throws back at you. It's just all the stuff that's going on and that you have no control over. And we sort of lead an X equals Y diagonal. We an undulating line where sometimes we're on top, we're doing well, and we feel like we're in control, and sometimes life's doing horrible things to us and we're very much out of control, and we're just sort of undulating this line. And because everything in our culture is telling us that we should be able to take full ownership of our lives by believing in ourselves, by thinking positively, by setting our goals, by whatever those things are. They come in various forms. The trick that's playing on us is making us think that we can somehow crank this line up to an entirely artificial space where our life is in line with our goals, and we sort of forget about this other axis here. It's not a coincidence that we used to call, or the ancient Greeks, or at least we used to refer to people as unfortunates if they sort of life had somehow failed them. And now we sometimes use that word losers. I mean, hopefully not that much, but nonetheless, it's a very different, the idea that we've somehow just lost, as opposed to there is this role of fortune, as they used to call it. So I think it's a really big thing to acknowledge, because when you do acknowledge and lean into that, you realize that although we all have our own struggles and our lives are different in so many ways, that the core experience of life not going well and the core, our infancies are fairly similar in a way, and then our childhood, we all start off with pretty much vulnerable to the same kind of things, and then of course our lives go off in different directions. But we're not that different at root, especially when it comes to just difficult things in life. So I think it's important, and it's in those times we tend to feel lonely and we feel isolated. We feel it must only be us. We feel we've let ourselves down. We might feel shame. We might, all these things that are very isolating. And I think it's helpful to realize that actually what we're experiencing is universal human stuff.
Yeah.
Which really fine. The moment we voice it to people, that people are sort of, they relate to it. It's there in front of us, but often hard to feel.
Yeah, that idea of fortune is really important, because if you see people, if you lean towards blame rather than fortune and acknowledging people are unfortunate, then or if you do lean more towards the idea of fortune and people can be unfortunate, then you're going to be more compassionate to yourself and others when things don't quite go right, rather than just blaming people because they didn't try hard enough or whatever. What I was going to ask you was about Stoicism. What you just said overlaps a lot with Stoicism as well.
Yeah.
So we find it fascinating on this module. We've talked about how kind of wisdom from 2,000 years ago seems to resonate so deeply in current times. Why do you think Stoicism is so popular at the moment?
Well, it was born at a time of high anxiety. You had, lots of kind of cultures that were fitting badly with each other. There were wars going on. It was just an unstable, difficult time. So I think it's no coincidence that it also is enjoying a resurgence now. It's also, it was the most popular, particularly amongst the kind of Roman middle class. It was a very, very well established sort of school of thought and way of life. So when Christianity took over, it had to kind of win over those early Stoics. So a lot of those ideas were sort of redressed in Christian language. So they're kind of familiar to us because they've drifted up to us over the last 2,000 years. So that serenity prayer idea of give me the courage to change the courage to change things I can and the wisdom to accept things I cannot, it's
Yeah.
But now known as, it's kind of Christian phrasing. Again, it's not surprising that we've kind of drifted out of that kind of Christian mode, largely, that we might go back to what preceded it and proved itself very popular. But as you all know, the mode of Stoicism, and I think it's sort of the key to its success is that it has a very specific way of looking at happiness, which is through a sort of negative filter, which avoid. Oh, someone's just disappeared. Am I still there?
No, you're okay. You're still here.
Okay. Oh, that was just someone else logging on, wasn't it? Hello.
Yeah.
That was. It approaches happiness as an avoidance of disturbance. So it's basically saying, how do you avoid things like, unnecessary anxiety, unnecessary disturbance? So again, in a kind of vaguely anxious age, that's quite a good way of looking at happiness, because then you can get your teeth into techniques and things to lean into and sort of exercises and things that might be helpful, which I think is how Stoicism is best seen, as opposed to a kind of a complete way of life. I think it's a set of spiritual exercises, they've been called, but certainly things to lean into as they're useful tools. Because the other way of seeing happiness, which is very ill-formed, just as a kind of a thing that we're sort of entitled to vaguely, we don't really know what it is. Is it a mood? Is it a passing thing? Is it more of a step back and look at your whole life? Like, what is that? It's very difficult then to know how to approach it. And I've always liked that image of the rainbow for happiness, because as you get closer to a rainbow, it sort of disappears. And happiness is a bit like that. So that was a big appeal to me of the Stoic mode. Was it kind of gave it finally a kind of just a way of kind of getting your teeth into a way of approaching it specifically and going, okay, it's the avoidance of unnecessary disturbance. That's kind of I think a helpful way of seeing it, because then that leads to their various tools and ways of doing that.
Yeah. And in relation to happiness as well, that one thing we've come back to is this idea of verbs and nouns. And you talk about how instead of seeing things as nouns and things that we can get and keep, like getting happiness and then finally being happy, actually understanding things as verbs, like things that we do, more about action. And we've talked about the idea of happiness as a verb, love as a verb,
success. Right,
yeah,
it's endless. Yeah,
it's in the doing, isn't it? That's where the
it's
joy.
in the doing. Yeah, and this slightly ties in with the limitations, I think, of Stoicism. It's as I said, I think it's very useful as a toolkit. Like if we're anxious about something or just bothered by something, and find ourselves like in that kind of recurring upset, can't get this thing out of our head. I think that thought of like, hang on, first of all, is it something that's in my control or is it not? And the things in our control, is it my own thoughts and actions, or is it someone else's stuff? And then if it's someone else's stuff, that thought of, or is it outcomes? Is it things that happen in the world that are just they're not really within my own sort of purview, then, or at least within my own realm of control, then in what ways would it be fine if this thing's happening? In what ways is it fine for that to be like that? And if there are ways that I still want to change that thing, well, I can still do that to the best of my ability. But again, the outcome may be something out of my control. The outcome may happen a generation after I've died. It may not necessarily be about me now, but just separating those two things and then going, so how is the stuff that's not in my control, how is that okay? How is that fine? And that is a really helpful thought a lot of the time, to go, oh, actually, it's okay if this person thinks I'm an idiot, or is it okay if this person doesn't like me? It's actually all right if this job's going to take longer than it should and this person's let me down. Maybe it's actually kind of fine. So really helpful. But where the limitations of that are, the feeling of Stoicism is sort of is pulling up. It's like shoring up your reserves, and it can feel like you're putting up a really solid wall sometimes, which sometimes is exactly what you want to do. But in terms of moving out into life and love and relationships, it's also kind of has its limitations. And although they sort of have something to say about all that, it doesn't really lean heavily into it. And I think that's where this starts to come in, this idea of verbing and so on. It's just about, there is a leaning into the world and into other people and into relationships and into things like compassion, and which I think are all really important. And in a way, they slightly conflict with the Stoic mode, which seems to be much more about a sort of slightly more isolated thing. But also, like a lot of things that seem to conflict, they actually just kind of complement it. It's not about, I've never seen, I embrace a lot of Stoicism, but I don't never wanted to be a Stoic. I think the moment you slap a label on something, that's sort of a bit like, well, then I can't do the stuff outside it because that's somehow conflicting with my belief system. Whereas, surely you want to take all the stuff that works. So, so you've had Alex Evans here, for example. So like I don't think he talks about this specifically, but I think a helpful thing. So like the environment, right? That's a big noun. And we start to see it as a thing. And then the moment it's just a thing, like love and success and happiness, you've kind of put it in a bit of a box. It's become like you can pack it away somewhere neatly and move on with your life. It's like it's not a vital activity that you're living and breathing every moment. And actually the environment it's literally the air that is on your tongue and in your lungs and against your skin. It's the ground that is underneath you. It's absolutely part of your living, breathing reality. And if you go back to not that long ago, and still indigenous cultures that still exist, there are that the whole idea of like breath, like the early alphabets were just consonants, right? And then you gave life to the consonants by supplying the vowel sounds by talking. Like the idea of breath gives life, and that whole idea goes. We can see that in the breath of God. We go back to Genesis, the idea of the breath of God giving life. The old words for spirit and breath were all the same. We're all the same thing. Like and those oral cultures gave life through speech and breath. I get like, so that whole and there was a proper dialogue with the environment there, right? That's a whole lived embodied experience with that person's environment. That was all so much part of just the very fabric of reality. There's a wonderful book by David Abrams you may have come across called The Spell of the Sensuous.
Yeah.
And he talks about this just briefly. It's not really an answer to your question. It's a lovely story. So
right.
he's an anthropologist, but also a magician, and he spent time out in somewhere in Southeast Asia with these indigenous cultures. Can't remember exactly where this was. But he had a story of living with a sort of a tribe, and the tribal chief, and there was the wife, and they're kind of in this compound, and every morning you were seeing the wife go out with these rice little things in leaves, like leaves. They go leaf and then rice, and she was going out with these things, putting them around the perimeter of the compound, and then at the end of the day she'd go and all the rice was gone. She'd bring the leaves back, and he asked her what she was doing. She said, "Oh, I'm leaving the rice out for the gods, so that they, or the spirits, so that they don't," which is a part of a kind of a peacemaking thing with the spirits. So that, and it was to do with protecting their own food that they were going to eat for their own feasts and so on. And his first thought was, sort of how sweet and how naive. And then he just sort of, but he did wonder what was happening to the rice, because at the end of the day it was gone. So he just was watching from a distance her do this, and he put the rice down, then he was watching from a distance, and he could see she'd go, and he started to see the rice move like on its own, and then like a bit of rice on the top would sort of move, and then it was like it was walking off, and he realized it was ants, right? Oh, the ants are taking the rice. And then he thought, oh, that's, bless her, she thinks that the ants are the spirits, right? She thinks the spirits are taking the rice, but actually what's happening is it's just the ants taking them. And then the penny dropped. Oh no, the ants are the spirits. So what's happening here, the dialogue with the spirits is actually it's like a relationship with the ants. There's like a dialogue. We'll give you the rice so you don't come in and eat all our food, so we can have these feasts. And she was fully aware it was ants, but the spirits, in inverted commas, it wasn't about ghostly dead relatives or anything. It was just about this kind of dialogue with the environment that was just part of the embodied experience of life. And our way of seeing it was to think of the spirit aspect of it like it was some sort of weird, floaty, ghostly kind of spiritual thing in that sense. But that's us dealing with the kind of, we're not very good at these kind of more mysterious, or we're not very good with these kind of embodied relationships with the environment. So we sort of decide, oh, that's just some sort of slightly naive kind of primitive belief system. But it wasn't. It was a very active, straightforward relationship with things like insects. And they just used, they used language like spirits, but it was a really eye-opening thing for him. My point is, if we see the environment, for example, in a much more embodied way, like it is a thing that we live and breathe every moment, and it isn't a noun with a capital E that's a thing, it's just an issue that's something to do with glaciers and species and something out there, it does make a difference. And likewise with love and happiness, these are our choices, they're decisions, and they're ways that we decide to see things and navigate through life at every moment. They are choices that we make. There are activities. Whereas if we do see them as love, if we see love as a thing, then we start to think about, is this person, what is this Mr. Right or Miss Right? Is this person right for me? Is it when will I find this thing? Like it's something, it's always a bit off in the distance, or it's love is no good, love is not for me, or or happiness is not for me. I'm never going to be happy. We start to just pack these things off into little packages, and it's just part of our nervous ego labeling and organizing so that we can move through life. And actually the reality of life is that it's messy and complicated and much more active than we think. So that's a long way around of saying that's the value of unpacking these things that we've learned to sort of see in this way. And again, that's got a whole history to it as well, of just isolating things and
Yeah.
viewing them from a kind of detached, contemplative way, and forgetting that these are all actually, more often than not, embodied things that we can take responsibility for ourselves in the moment, and how we navigate our way through them. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it leads on perfectly to what I was going to ask you about next. So in recent weeks, we've talked about transcendence and spirituality, and the importance of transcendence, and understanding that this kind of what Jung described as this innate tendency we have to sort of need transcendence. And we've tried to talk about these ideas of transcendence and spirituality, not limited to religion, but in all of the different shapes and forms that are plausible and relevant to modern life. How would you say, you've given some good examples before, how would you say, how can we find transcendence in modern life, when it's a word that's kind of attached to what religion used to try and do? And for many people it still does, religion does it very well, but there's more to transcendence than that, and there are ways of transcending in modern life that are really important, and you've talked about that before. Do you want to share some of those ideas?
Yeah, and again, transcendence is another like big noun with a capital T. It makes it sound far less active and, you know, moment to moment than it actually is. So not seeing it as a big kind of scary thing that does have all these religious kind of connotations. I think if you look at religion, it's actually quite a good example of it, right? So if you just take the Christian religion that certainly for me I'm most familiar with. So I was a proper Christian, quite happy clappy for a long time, and then came out of it proper full-blown atheist, and now I've kind of got a softer, kind of more forgiving approach to it. But probably what happened there within that story is something happened a couple of thousand years ago with some charismatic figure, and the world was so different, and the way we formed our beliefs was so different. The whole structure was of our kind of psychology was so very different around this time. So within that sort of strange world, there was some kind of compelling story or narrative that people bought into, and they probably had a very embodied experience of whatever that was, based around this figure and that early movement. And then and probably that was tied in with a feeling of this sort of redemption for, you know, people that were poor and downtrodden, and that they were going to experience some sort of earthly salvation that was coming. And then it sort of didn't come, and it moves on to the idea of, oh, it'll happen after you kind of die. It's something for the future. And then Jesus, whoever he was, dies as well, and then it starts to become no longer something that was existing in people's sort of embodied experience at the time, or even in their living memory. It starts to become something that this sort of an early cult has now formed around this idea, but now it's harking back to something that happened in the past. And a very common thing that used to happen at that time is that you would take the leader of your sort of your cult, and you would ascribe stories to them that had happened, but they were stories that were being made up in the present, but you tell them as historical stories. So therefore we start to get all these stories around it. But the important thing is, in replace of this embodied experience, what you'd start to have is a belief system that would arise instead. And you're trying to recreate what for some people would have been an original lived experience in the moment, whatever that was, by creating a sort of belief. And then to sustain the belief, you're sort of create sort of dogmas and things around it, that if you can just go through these practices, you'll somehow recreate whatever this original thing was. And then time just keeps moving on, and then that church that's created these dogmas and so on becomes politicized and monetized and powerful and political, and then time just keeps moving on. And now we're in an age where we're very scientifically minded, and we want our proof, our evidence for things, and it becomes very easy to pull apart modern Christianity on those grounds, because of course it doesn't really hold up under that kind of spotlight. There's no reason why it should. I think it's doing a different job, and that different job is, if you see it as a signpost, it's trying to point back very badly, in a very badly articulated way, but to something that originally was an experience of transcendence, of life can be better, and there is something bigger than me that will give meaning to my life. And I think that's the key, and that's just a very human urge, and is really important for us to find it in some way, because that's how we find meaning in life. We find something that's bigger than ourselves, whatever that is, and we kind of throw ourselves into that thing. And it doesn't have to be a religion. It's just that kind of feels like it's the basic, like, core, easy way of doing it, that you can just give that message to people in a nice package. And then you look at, the Christ story of death and resurrection, and maybe that has stuck around because, in terms of our own psychological template, knowing that all through life we have to let things die and pass away in order to grow. We have to, you don't let go of your mum or your dad's hand when you cross it. You don't learn to cross the road on your own without at some point letting go of a parent's hand and taking that risk. You don't change your job and get a better job or make some improvement without having to let something go. There's always a sacrifice in order to grow and move forward. Otherwise, you're just going around in circles. So actually, maybe some of those aspects of the religious stories that have stuck around, and death and resurrection is a really big one. Virgin births is another one. You find them all through various religions, because they actually sort of kind of tickle something at the back of our collective unconscious, or at least in the idea of what is helpful to us as a story, to show us the way of moving forward, or that life's fine, or to show us where we are in some kind of narrative of what life is. I think all that's important. So wherever we find it, the thing that's bigger than ourselves is so helpful. And it might be in your kids, it might be in a passion, it might be in making stuff or whatever, or a cause. It doesn't really matter. It's not about spirituality as such, but it's particularly as we sort of move through life. Often, like when we're younger, it's hard to really sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's easy to actually throw yourself into a cause when you're younger. But we definitely change as we get older, and we start to find it in different ways. But to look out for that, because if we don't look out for it, I suppose what happens is we pin the same need for that kind of, the equivalent of the heavenly afterlife of kind of, a golden, more exciting, more meaningful life. We pin it on the wrong things. We pin it on fame, money, success, because that's all our culture sort of offers us. They don't really do the job. Those things don't make you any happier. They look like they're going to, but they don't. Fame doesn't make you any happier, because nice things get nicer, but horrible things get much, much worse. So yeah, you might get I don't know, people taking pictures of you. Sometimes that's nice. Horrible other times. You might get an upgrade in a restaurant, but you got stalkers. You might find your life's more interesting in some ways, but then your private life might be all over the tabloids. So there's just balances out, and similar thing happens with money. It's not it all looks very exciting from the outside, but you realize as you go into it, you're just taking yourself with you. So your own psychological state is there. Plus, if you've needed those things and you're searching for them, then of course you never really have enough. You're all your insecurities come with you, and you find you're never really achieving the place you're trying to get to. So it's a bad place to pin those very important human urges of transcendence, by which I mean just life being more meaningful and maybe more fun, or maybe more something than it is now. That's a really important and understandable human urge. And I think religion is sort of talking to that in one way, but we can also find our own ways. But it's important. We can hear you, Arthur. It's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater when we dismiss religion on modern scientific grounds, and it's really easy to pull apart, because of course it's really silly when it tries to prove itself. But I think it's articulating something else which is of use.
Yeah, we talked about this last week. I find the Christian mystics, and we chatted very briefly before about the Father Richard Rohr and these people who are actually trying to go back to very, very early understandings of Christianity and scripture, and to cut through the stuff you talked about a minute ago with the money and the politics and the institution and the corruption, all those things that it became about, and control and power, and actually going back to its earliest messages, which also therefore have a lot in common with other religions as well. So then you can understand the connections between different cultures and faiths. And actually, when you get to those contemplative traditions that are looking at the importance of transcendence and different pathways to transcendence or God, if you're a person of faith, whatever, I think that's really important. And what's significant as well is and I'm weaving this onto my next question now, but there is a link. It's Carl Jung. So even in this work we've been doing with people like Richard Raw, Carl Jung is a recurring figure that keeps coming up in many different contexts and traditions of research and even popular culture. When you were on Desert Island Discs, you said, if I remember rightly, you were given a choice to, when you go off to when you're cast away onto your desert island, you could take one book as well.
Yeah.
And you chose the complete works of Carl Jung.
Yeah.
Why is that?
It isn't really one book, but I snuck it in. Yeah, I do really like him. I mean, he's quite kind of fruity by a lot of sort of today's standards, which is fine. And you know, there are some parts of it I enjoy more than others, but I just love they're just a great read. As is Freud. I mean, it's a phenomenal read. I mean, they're great. They're all just sort of great stories. There's a lovely mode of writing. And there's a modern I think psychoanalyst and quite what is a kind of certainly a psychotherapist called Irvin Yalom, Yalom, who writes beautiful books that are just collections of little sort of vignettes with his clients, and they're so addictive. They're like reading sort of mystery stories, but they're real life, really, really lovely read. And they all owe this tradition back to Freud and Jung, because that's just their sort of mode of writing. But what I like, there are things that really resonate with me, I think, about Jung more than anything is the Freud takes everything back to, you know, the Freudian cliches of, you know, early experiences as an infant of, you know, just difficulty and seeing your parents having sex and all those things. It's very much takes things back as to these sort of historical roots. And Jung's a lot more interested in how we're kind of, you know, navigating and moving through life from moment to moment. And he has this lovely sort of arc of life. He talks a lot about the first half of life and the second half of life, and he sort of talks about it like the sun sort of going up and then coming back down again. And there's so much modern research around the second half of life and how that what tends to happen. And I say this to most of you that are very much in the first half of your lives, but there's a general pattern in the first half of your life that you are you're having a sense of what's going to make you happy and be valuable. And that's sort of out on the horizon somewhere generally. So you're kind of working towards that. And it's actually really important because there's a natural sort of optimism that's coming with that. And that's going to keep propelling you forward and give you drive. And some of those things you'll also achieve. And a lot of them, you sort of other things you find they won't. They just kind of keep receding further into the distance. But that's fine. It gives a sense of forward movement. But there's also a sort of a dialogue there, isn't there, with the world? Because the world's telling us at that age what's important, what will make us feel successful, and what will give us a sense of meaning, and what will secure our reputation in the world. And whether that's things and achievements, or, you know, all the social media stuff, all, you know, how we're going to sort of fit in with the kind of audiences we found and so on. It's very much a dialogue with the outside world. What should we be doing in order to feel like we're on the right path? Something happens around midlife where we catch up with that and we realize it hasn't quite delivered on the goods. And even if we have achieved all these great things and feel very successful, it can feel very empty because we sort of might have this feeling of, oh, was that it? It's like you've done the journey and then you've reached the destination, but it turns out the destination is just putting your bag down at the end of the journey. It's not like, and now I'm here. It's just, okay, take my coat off. Now what? And maybe there's nothing, because maybe the thing you were aiming to is you sort of ended. And it's like the very thing that actually was giving your life meaning, you've now removed from the equation because you've achieved the thing that you were trying to get to, and it was getting there that was giving your life meaning, turned out not to be the thing itself at the end. So then the second half of life, sort of, there is a natural shift. And it's worth knowing all this because it's such a universal pattern that when we get there, it's really good to be sort of equipped with this kind of stuff. So there's often a sense of meaningless and confusion around midlife, which is like, whatever, it varies for people, but let's say like 40s, mid 40s, maybe even like, you know, sort of early 50s. And then it's like you've arrived in the clearing, you found your way through the forest, and now what? And what is really helpful to happen is that your dialogue shifts to internal cues rather than external. So you start to listen to yourself more than the outside world, to sense like what you need, what you really should now be doing in life. And it's like you've gathered a whole load of experience, and now that's going to be something that's more like a sort of a wisdom rather than stuff you need to acquire. And that's when we might start becoming teachers. And often your skill set, the thing you've been good at, might actually start to, you might find you're not so good at it. Like you might have been a great musician or a great whatever, and you might start to find that, oh, your technical skills starting to sort of wave a bit. And there's another sort of intelligence that comes in, which is this sort of more fluid intelligence, it's called, rather than the fluid intelligence is the name given to the earlier half, our skills, and then the second half is a more crystallized intelligence, it gets called, which means you may not find yourself as good at the thing you were doing, but you're much better at teaching it and imparting that knowledge to others, or there's a sort of wisdomy thing that happens, and you start to listen to your own sense of what actually brings you joy and meaning and pleasure and what is important. And it's like you can stop listening to everybody else and listen to yourself. And there's a dip, like, so there's a sort of an unhappiness that often comes in that middle life bit. But if you understand what's happening, it doesn't last that long. And then there's an upwards afterwards where we all get a lot happier afterwards. It's a bit like another adolescence we go through, and we can all look back on adolescence and go, oh, it's fine. They're just going through a passage and it's okay because we've all done it. But we haven't done the other one at the other end. So we're all a bit scared of what's this midlife crisis. It's just another thing. Anyway, I only mention that to you now because some in the back of your mind, under the next book I'd like to write about these predictable sort of crises and things of life, because it really helps when you get there to, again, know this is something that's making me feel very isolated, but it's something we all share. It's part of the absolute core human experience. Totally forgotten your question. Oh yeah, Jung, that's right. So he's just very into that kind of thing, very into what are these passages of life, and what are the helpful sort of images and ideas and things that can help us navigate that. And ultimately that's all life is. It's how do you navigate the difficult stuff? How do you face all the stuff that you've sort of buried and you're trying not to think about, but that's starting to have a bit of a ownership of you, that, you know, at some point you're going to integrate that more into your life, because then you move through life with more ease, just a bit more grace, if you start to actually look at the stuff that you find, you know, that makes you feel resentful or envious, rather than just sort of bury it. But all that stuff comes in time. It's not, you know, necessarily for now.
Yeah, we talked a lot about shadow integration and looking at those things that and it applies personally in our lives, but also collectively as societies. We have to look at these things that we don't necessarily want to look at and integrate them consciously so that they're less unhealthy in how we behave and think and so on. We've also talked about in terms of archetypes, the importance of not just, when Jung talks about archetypes and we see them as these kind of recurring behavioral patterns that humans all share. We don't just want to look at them. They're a really kind of fun and interesting and helpful way of learning about them is to see them in explicit fictional texts. When we start to understand them in more kind of non-fictional contexts, and then also in our personal lives, how we experience certain archetypal forms, some more prevalently than others, depending on our character experience and so on. One that we keep coming back to is the importance of wiser elders and transformation, and how the magician archetype is often about creating transformational spaces. Mentors as well that take on that wiser elder form. You've talked previously about people who have been really important at different stages of your life and career. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that role of the mentor and the role of the wise elder can really who kind of stops us along the path on our journey and gives us something to think about, or shares a bit of knowledge, or helps us understand something about ourselves. How can we understand the importance of that dynamic in our personal lives?
Well, I think first of all, after reading your book, largely about me, which of course I devoured, in this sort of glow of pride, I made sure the cover was, wide open when I was reading that. Sort of pointing it out like that with my finger. You talk about so Susan Barlow talks about this thing of the two archetypes, and there's something always about archetypes that feels a little bit too neat just by their kind of nature, or a little bit sort of like you're in some sort of slightly kind of mystical parallel universe, that makes them always kind of really, I think, sort of compelling because we recognize them, but also something, for me, something sort of slightly missing. And after that, I was reading a book about how skills develop and how we move from, it's all very unnecessarily gendered, but they're very old terms of going from being an apprentice to being a journeyman, it's called, and then to a master of your craft. So substitute those terms for others. But it's an old pattern of how people would develop their craft. So your first stage, whatever you're doing, whatever you're into, you're kind of, you're finding your way, and you're learning from other people, and you're probably shielded a little bit from going out into the public with whatever this thing is. Imagine you're, sort of painting or making things, because that's what, it has been historically, but it could be any sort of craft, could be learning magic or anything. And then you gain the skills, and then you have your sort of apprenticeship bit. So you're what's called the journeyman bit, or you're just out in the world doing it, and you're kind of, now you're learning it in the real world. And you're kind of, what happens is you start to learn that it's not about you. And that's when whatever job you do will get better when it's not about you. So as a magician, for me, deciding my shows were not going to be about me looking great, but we're going to be about the audience. We're going to be about the human experience of the audience, I think made a real difference. If you're a teacher of any sort, if you make it all about you and about being liked or how you're doing compared to your colleagues, you're not going to do as good a job as if you make it about the students and the people that you're trying to actually impart something to. Every job gets better when you make it about not yourself. So that's like a sort of a second stage. And then finally, there's this sort of like expert stage, whatever you want to call it, when the natural thing is you which tends to coincide with later in life, when you're then you naturally tend to want to impart the knowledge. You want to kind of share it in some form. And people set up, institutions, or they might want to give something back to the very industry or craft or world that's their own career that's got them so far. There is a natural, again, it's the wisdom thing. And I realized that's actually all that Susan Barlow is talking about. It's not a kind of, I don't think it's about two different types of magician, really. I think it's about a very natural curve that comes with getting better at something, but pursuing it through those stages into any kind of expert stage. Also, you can look at it as that Jungian sort of curve of life, into the natural impulse is to move into this sort of wiser thing, which is all about giving. And therefore it's all about transparency, and it's all about all of those things that she just describes in a different way as a kind of enlightened figure. But I think what I found helpful was the thought, okay, it isn't like this enlightened person has sort of discovered some great knowledge that sets them apart necessarily. It might just be part of this natural flow of pursuing an interest and an activity through all its stages into later life and everything that comes with it. And then it feels much more earthbound, I think, than the archetype thing. So, and again, it's whatever's helpful. And sometimes an archetypal image is very helpful. It was very flattering reading it and thinking of myself in that mode. But the day I was reading that, I couldn't find my AirPods. I was looking at them for 10 minutes. They were in my ears. So I don't know really whether I could call myself enlightened. But I found that a helpful sort of other way of looking at it too. And yes, that figure of course, exist. I'm sure you've discussed them all. They're all over the place, you know, Star Wars, Harry Potter, anything, Mary Poppins, they're all over the place. And it resonates because it is part of how it's all part of how we move through life, how we learn from those figures. And then in later life, how we ourselves will probably become those sorts of figures. There might even be an evolutionary basis to it, that like we're probably beyond the age of having kids. So our job is to now change to support the group, to kind of impart a wisdom to the tribe and therefore keep the tribe stronger. It's like it's probably has its roots in all that too.
What you're saying makes complete sense, because I'm thinking back now about how when I started to write the book, and once it started to come together, I looked at the point of all the things that I was interested in talking about, and I thought, well, this is all from that kind of second half of your career, and where you talked a lot on podcasts about how you were looking back, and you had that feeling that you didn't want to just keep doing tricks, and you didn't want to just keep entertaining the kind of attention-seeking urge of being a magician or whatever, and then you kind of took a step back and put people through experiences and so on. It was stuff that really interested me.
So if you're a 23-year-old magician reading Susan Barlow, you'd be hard pushed to go, okay, I'm going to do that, then I'll be enlightened. It doesn't really work. It is absolutely about, I think, age and moving forward. It's still a very helpful image. That's the nice thing about archetypes. It kind of goes and brings everything together, and you go, oh, I can see that now. I can see the value of that. So I think it is helpful, but you can't push these things. But again, it's just helpful to know, oh, that's the way that curve sort of pans out into the future. And then it's just nice to have that in the back of your mind, and to know that if you, for example, if you pursue an activity, depends on what the activity is, but probably your skills at that thing, you might find they start to wane. Like it might even be in your 30s there, and there's research done on different skills and when this happens, but you might find that you're not as good at what you do. And it's earlier than you think. It is literally like it's in your 30s, like late 30s, you start to think, oh, I'm not as good at this. But that's fine, because there is another curve that you can jump on. There will be another wave to this. It'll be a different experience of that craft or talent. But but all of that's fine. I think that's all part of what's playing out there.
Yeah. We've
very isolating on the one hand, but exactly what we share on the other.
Yeah. And when we approach archetypes and stuff, we often talk about one at a time when we're analysing one. But in reality, there's often blends of multiple archetypal forms and behaviours operating at the same time anyway. So this stuff's, it's never as rigid as we often make it out on paper. But I'm aware that we're running out of time. So before we do, I wanted to bring it back to university life, the conversation back to university life. You said something that I could really relate to. Because when I went to uni, I was first generation in my family to go, and my parents were like, this is brilliant. Just go and we trust you. If that's what we don't know, we're not going to pretend to know. You just go and do. And I just had once I settled into uni and didn't feel like a fish out of water, I really started to flourish, and it was the freedom they gave me to just pursue. My light's gone off.
Your light has gone off.
My back. To pursue what I wanted to, and I had that freedom. I didn't have any pressure. I wasn't being steered in one direction. I didn't. You've talked about a similar experience in that respect. Do you just want to do it studying law and stuff? Do you just
I had exactly the same. I was studying law and German, and I realized pretty early on that I didn't want to be a lawyer or a German. But the experience of doing the law wasn't. I kind of sort of enjoyed some aspects of it, but I realized this isn't what I'm going to do. And I saw a hypnotist perform in my first year at university, and just decided to pursue that. I was like, I am going to do that. And it ticked a lot of boxes for me that I probably didn't even know I had, about control and about performing and attention seeking, all sorts of things. But that was it. I was totally threw myself into that. But I remember at the end of my first year going to do those exams, and I wish I knew a lot of other lawyers, and they were all under this pressure from their parents. And I'd never come across that idea that they'd be worried about failing, not for themselves, but what their parents were going to think. And I wrote a letter to my mum and dad, just thanking them for that, the fact that wasn't a thing for me. they had given me that space. The only thing they ever sort of really ever said, look, you really should do this, is learn how to drive, which I don't do. I don't drive. I think I was so sort of like horrified at the thought they were making me do anything. Yeah, I did find that a useful thing, and I pursued the law, and I finished the degree, and the German that degree, and sort of a bit useless, really, law, in a way, if you're not going to do it. I mean, pretty much anything you study, you normally find, even if you don't do it as a career, you've got a body of knowledge. Law doesn't even give you that, because the bits of law I can remember, I couldn't possibly ever give as advice to anybody, because probably the law has changed. So it's just a lot of dry learning and absolutely no use in real life after that. But it's clear that it's the experience of just doing that and just being there at university for that period was massively formative and helpful for me.
Yeah.
Just hypnotizing people all the time, and you kind of just have these years to sort of let something solidify in terms of who you are. It's just nice to have that space for it, even if it doesn't actually end up relating to the thing that you're studying.
Sure. Well, this lot here are going to be graduating in the summer. I said to you earlier on, it's been my favourite semester of teaching. We've all clicked together as a group. They've worked incredibly hard. They've been through.
You do say the nicest things about them. I have to say, when we've sat down and have a cup of tea, you are so full of like just glowing love for these people.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I sometimes think, are they just saying that just to get us to work hard? But
no. He definitely means it. It's lovely.
Yeah. And the fact that off the back of the lockdowns, they've had strikes and interruptions and all sorts, but they've just been an absolute joy. They're really resilient and interesting and fun and funny. So, we're not going to keep you any longer, but thank you for your time. Thank you for talking to us. You've been a joy. It's been nice getting to know you, and you've been as kind as I hoped you would be. So we've all got to dash off now, so we're going to just finish and thank you very much. Sure,
thank you very much. Thank you in particular to Chloe, Clayton and Amy, who are the only two faces I've seen throughout this whole thing. So thank you for your general smiling feedback. But yeah, thanks everybody. And Darren, thank you very much indeed for having me. I have a show to do, so I'm going to go and, well, not quite now, but I'm going to go and get things ready. But lovely, very lovely to meet you all. And
brilliant.
Really, again, very hugely flattered for the book. So thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.